All right. Well, welcome back to Land of the Giants. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. And so we are doing the Fountainhead part two. Do you want to do your own part of the theme song?
None but ourselves can free our minds.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. So part two of the Fountainhead, we couldn't quite get through the massive book in part one. So last time I said we do ladies first, but I was in the middle of two different points at the end of the last episode, so I'm gonna quick bring the viewers up to speed on them. But basically, the Fountainhead is a giant book by Ayn Rand, and last time I was talking about the temple that Howard Rourke, he's the Fountainhead character. He makes a temple, and um, a little later in the book, the girl he likes, Dominique Francon, marries a newspaper kind of like a newspaper guy, kind of like William Randolph Hearst, who is called
I do.
Gail Wynand, and
Yep.
Gail Wynand is like the person who wants to be big no matter what. So
Yep.
he adapts what he does to what to the masses.
Yep.
Whereas Howard Rourke wants to be the creative force in his life, and he would rather be creative and small than be a big servant, which is what Gail Wynand is.
Yeah. I think that's Rand trying to work out a definition of what integrity is, right? And saying that it is almost better to have no audience. I mean, I would say she pushes it so far as to say that build for nobody and build in his way than sacrifice his own autonomy, really, right? Because remember, we talked about the fact that he's not trying to derive value from being iconoclastic. He's not trying to say my buildings are worth something because they're not that. He's saying those sets of assessments are not even relevant because it's all self-generated.
Yeah,
You know.
and you know, well, one thing I've been doing in Bitcoin is to try to figure out what kind of heroes I'm looking for. So I've been looking in like literature and old movies and things, and that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm developing my own standards, and that's good. That makes you more powerful when you have your standards. Um,
I think that's right because I think unless you can, I mean, this is a little bit the take that I'm bringing to my kind of discussion on Bitcoin, which is how postmodern it is, right? So it's so self-referential and it's so self-conscious. And to a certain extent, for me anyway, the only way you can maintain integrity is to be clear around what your values and your definitions, one's definitions of heroism is, because then you actually create the capacity to talk about what the other versions of truth are. You know, otherwise there's a kind of intellectual dishonesty, and maybe that's one of the things I resonate in terms of Rand's work is that she is really trying to pull out and tease out what happens when people are sort of intellectually or morally dishonest with themselves.
well, so and one of the tactics that religions use is that they don't define words properly, and they talk in a way that ensures different people will interpret them differently.
Yeah, I
So
agree. I agree.
you can have some people who say it's all a metaphor for the human experience or whatever, and then you can have some people who really think they need to flagellate themselves, or God is going to strike them with lightning, or whatever, and the people are not individually supposed to discuss their own philosophies with one another. It is supposed to be the central person, the priest, talking, and he talks in a way where you can interpret him in many different ways.
No, I mean, I think that's right. What you say brings to mind this idea that I've been thinking about recently about the need for certainty, right? Whether that's in the futures market, which is really trying to sort of have a relationship with volatility, which is all about a comment about the present and uncertainty, and the kind of religious experience that requires you to simply listen and absorb rather than invites you to be in conversation. Some of these really profound emotional needs we have around whether it's risk or certainty, and at the same time, like how dead life is if you take away all of the uncertainty and the present unknowns. You can see why people have absolutely a vulnerability and need, whichever way you want to put it, to kind of sign up to systems that require them to sort of think once and then not think anymore. Because it is emotionally challenging to continually, whether it's riding waves of volatility or to be in continual discussion about what is true and what is real and who is telling me what and why. And it does kind of get to both the liberation and the challenge of Bitcoin in terms of requiring, as we've talked before, for people to think for themselves, to have thinking being an ongoing exercise, and taking a degree of autonomy that we are absolutely not socialized or conditioned to embrace.
Well, yeah, well, that leads into one of the topics I wanted to talk about is how Ayn Rand kind of became a cult leader when that seems to go against the core of the Fountainhead so strongly, and how did that happen? And I have some ideas on that, but I also wanted to talk about your complete the the need for certainty, and that is something that makes people vulnerable because you could never
Yeah.
really have certainty, and when people are tricked into thinking they have it, then they can be exploited. As
I think so, and I think I would sort of I'd throw Freud back in to say that in some ways, we're all trying to search for alternative certainties that kind of balance or obliterate the very few certainties that we have, which are, death, and depending on where you live, possibly taxes.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to the book. So so let's talk about the temple, because I think the temple is really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And Howard Rourke is supposed to make the temple to the human spirit. And in the center of the temple is a big statue of a nude woman.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that is Ayn Rand making herself into the goddess. Because there's not
Absolutely.
supposed to be supernatural beings, but this is like it's a statue represents the ideal to which humans are trying to attain. So, and Ayn Rand, she wants to be that ideal.
I think so. I mean, I think she's also kind of quoting something that predates Christianity and predates religions that have male godhead figures. I mean, she is quoting this very, very ancient um, association with the female life form, life itself, creation. I mean, as you and I have chatted in private before about some of the ancient artifacts, some of the oldest art that exists is precisely a form of female body representational goddess deity stuff.
Oh,
So
no, absolutely. No, I really think that the temple to the human spirit, that it is like the Venus figure, but it's
yes,
like
yes.
it's like a Venus figure, but for a future society. That's kind of the idea.
Yes, and I think you're seeing in her, whether she's talking about the kind of non-verbal instinctive sexuality in the book, if you're talking about the statue. I mean, there's a lot of sort of pagan quotation here, right? That to me also is interesting, given that this woman grew up during a period of time where Christianity itself was being very explicitly stripped from the Russian state, and yet, as we can even see today, and the particularly the Madonna worship in Russian culture is profound, no? So I think, again, if we think about Rand's work being first and foremost, a text where she is working out her own ideas, yeah? As much as she consciously is doing it for a reader, she is ultimately, I think, doing a degree of deprogramming. So the recognition of both sort of female sexuality and its creative force I think are really ways in which she's trying to construct an image of herself for herself. Yeah.
Oh, sure. And well, and I thought that that was so interesting that I actually put that in the story that I'm working on. So, not well, not to reveal too much, but I made a character who imagines herself as the Venus figure for a future society. I thought that that was great. So then what happens to the temple is Ellsworth Toohey, the tempter, the evil corrupter character. He convinces the person who commissioned the temple that it was a bad idea and it's no good, and eventually the temple is like converted into apartments or something, so people can no longer see what it's supposed to be. I don't remember exactly, but something like that happens. And here there's a point in the book that I always remembered because it's like such a perfect example of how ridiculous Ayn Rand's writing can be, because this is where Howard Rourke and Ellsworth Toohey have their confrontation, and
Mm-hmm.
in before this ruined temple. And Ellsworth Toohey says, "Well, come on, you. Why don't you tell me what you really think of me?" And Howard Rourke says, "But Mr. Toohey, I don't think of you." And it
The
is
ultimate
like
put down,
so
right?
stupid. Because
Yeah,
if you really didn't think of, if you really didn't think of somebody, you would just turn around and not talk to him. It is
right. I
like,
mean, it's kind of like ghosting, right? It's kind of like ghosting. It's like, yeah, so I'm not really thinking about you, but I am kind of thinking about you. I mean, I think that's a very powerful point you make, right? Like to pull that one out, because I mean, I have to admit that as a teenager, I was definitely taken by all the kinds of concepts swirling around that one, right?
yeah,
That I could elevate myself to a point where, or that articulation of power, yes, that to the ant you are a giant, but to the giant you don't even exist. I think that's what she's trying to kind of capture there. No.
yeah. Well, I mean, I really agree with the sentiment, but it comes out kind of funny to me.
Yeah, no, she was clearly not a scriptwriter. No, and thank God we
Right.
don't have Anne Rand plays. Can you
So,
imagine?
so then Dominique Franken, she marries Gail Wynand because she was like, Howard Rourke, your light is too bright for me. I'm trying to avoid you. And when I first read this book, this all of this stuff was completely confusing to me. Like I had no idea what was going on with her, because I was like, what, why? um, but her insanity drives the story.
Oh,
So
I agree with you completely, and I think that I think the whole thing is a working out of the ambiguous tension that you see in the Dominique character, right? It's both being attracted to greatness, repelled by greatness, because it's all of a discussion about what is her own capacity for greatness. No, and this whole desire to destroy your object of affection, I think is still capturing or disturbing, because it does get to something that people in polite society don't really want to talk about too much. And anybody who's been in the throes of a certain kind of passion that challenges the boundaries of your own self, you can end up being very ambiguous about it. We see in small children too, the toy that the 2-year-old both wants to destroy and can't sleep without. I think there's something pretty deep there that she's putting her finger on.
whoa. Yeah, well, when I first read this, I was like, what does Howard Rourke see in her? Why doesn't he just date somebody who is not a complete crazy person? But
Because that I think has to do with the idea that, like, the difficulty of the object that you acquire gives it value, no?
yes.
So to tame a crazy person is a way greater achievement than to get a sane person to follow you. You know what's going on for him.
Well, so I was saying, like, I was totally confused by this stuff when I first read this book, but to me now it seems more like like a truer depiction of love and romance than you would normally see in well it brings me back to like ancient Greece, because they would say love is madness, and
Right.
they don't have a romanticized notion of love, and people who fall in love are they are often people who are going to get hurt really badly, you know.
Right, right. And I think that's why it's related to poetry, right? I mean, the ancient Greeks are also talking about the divine madness of the poet, which is another kind of way of saying that this passion or mania or heightened state of consciousness is all of a same cluster. So the kind of mania of profound romantic sexual one dissolvingness love is not so different from like the one dissolvingness love that happens with poetry. No, and I think that there was a corresponding sort of recognition of all of the like quotidian day-to-day stuff that goes with constructing domestic whatever, whether they're you know, we live in a world where people live as couples as opposed to in groups, but I definitely think that what she is describing, and then, you know, after our talk last week, I went and looked again at Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, and she was the mistress of Jean-Paul Sartre for whatever it was, 20 years. And I think that both of those writers are talking about truths about what it is like to be both the object of sexual desire and the initiator of sexual desire as a female who wants to maintain a degree of autonomy, which in the case of these women is expressed through their right to authorship. Yeah, so I think that when we look at the ways in which the male character in, you know, characters in Fountainhead are being sort of moved around to kind of intellectual chessboard, we see Rand trying to figure out how does she deal with what are constructed as masculinized parts in herself. Same thing with Dominique. Like, how do I cope with being both female and male? How do I cope with both wanting to be the destroyer and the destroyed? I mean, there's something quite existentially sort of universal in that, is kind of what I think.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a compelling story, if difficult to interpret. But anyway, well, for me anyway. But so
Me too.
so so
I find it, I mean, to be honest with you, I find Fountainhead still to this day a more uncomfortable read. Okay. And that would suggest that it's holding up mirrors than Atlas Shrugged, which I find to be, at this point, kind of an interesting read because of what it tells me about the kind of religion that's developed around certain passages of that book.
oh yeah, well, Atlas Shrugged doesn't have a Dominique Francon character in it. Everybody is kind of like a Randroid. Although there is some great stuff in it. I think Fountainhead is way better. Um,
Yeah, I
but
think you do.
but anyway, yeah. So Dominique, she doesn't want to destroy Howard Rourke, or at least that's one reason. But so she goes with Gail Wynand instead because he's already destroyed.
Exactly.
Um,
I
so
can relate to this, right?
so and so then something really interesting happens, because Howard Rourke builds, well, so Gail Wynand wants to protect her from the world. Okay, he wants to keep her away from society and keep her protected, so that she is not corrupted by the world like he is. And Howard Rourke builds the country house in which Dominique resides while she is married to Gail Wynand. And there was another great example of silly Ayn Rand dialogue here, because there's this wonderful parallel between the temple and the statue, with the country house and Dominique Francon, and she actually has a character in the story point this out. And he says, I don't remember exactly, but he says something like, wow, this country house is a lot like that temple you built a while back, like.
Signposting all the way. I mean, in some ways, in some ways I have to think of this also like it's a PhD, In a lot of ways, the stylistic issues are like anybody facing writing a PhD, where, you know, on page 250, you have to go, okay, well, we have seen this, we have seen that, and now we are going to see this, and we are going to see that. You know? And 10 pages later, you say, well, we have seen this, and we will see that. So, I mean, there is all of this kind of structural stuff. And I have to admit that, you know, when I was 19 years old, I went through a real small phase where I thought that people actually walked around and talked like this, right? So I got to Harvard and I thought, oh, well, if I just have these heroic conversations, you know, and that lasted about 6 months.
Oh, wow. Awkward 6 months there.
Oh, it was bizarre. Yeah, we'll just chalk it down to transitional phase.
So, well, one thing I think is funny is imagining like being an editor and trying to explain to somebody that you cannot just have a character explain the symbolism in the story itself. Like how is that not obvious? Like I would be like, what do I even need to explain here? Like that's not how that's not how writing is supposed to work.
Right, exactly. I mean, all writing is made better by the removal of words. I think, you know, in some ways, Twitter would get better if they reduce the number of characters that they would allow. You know, I mean, there is always a lot to be said for taking stuff out. And I think what's also kind of interesting about Rand's work and any other piece of thought or creative work is that so often when you go to look at it, the thing that is missing are the very basic assumptions that anybody who writes is in danger of not pointing out the most basic assumptions that their writing starts off with, right? And I think that what Rand is trying to do is overly reveal the architecture, the structure, the scaffolding of what it is that she's trying to do. It's like she's going along and continually kind of going, but this is really what this is all about. You know, these are really the assumptions that are being addressed in this. And then carry on with some characters doing this thing and that thing and all the rest of it, right?
Yeah, no, that describes it perfectly. Yes. And there's some things about her writing that is just so agonizing, and I like it's just hard for me to imagine being an editor and saying, can't we get rid of this? And she's like, no, we have to make sure that they get it.
Oh my God, totally terrifying. And you've seen pictures of her, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to argue with her. And I think, but you know, I think it's a good point you raise in it, because it's making me think about how she came to be published, how she came to get recognition. You know, the very fact that she was so sort of dismissed, and the success of her books was so, the publishing was such a marginal exercise, and it was really kind of like an underground phenomenon that by the time she came to write the next, you know, doorstopper, I don't think there's anybody who could have edited Atlas Shrugged. You know, she just wouldn't have allowed it. So I think, again, I return to a point, an insight I had when I first started talking to you about this, is that as much as we say this about her writing, it is remarkable that she still manages to get a person to read her all the way through. So there is something kind of S&M-y about the whole thing. You know, you're hating it, but you're still doing it.
Yes. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. So, so I think that the last section of the book is kind of less interesting, and there's this thing about how Rourke builds an apartment building, and they change it around a lot, and then he blows it up. And to me, that is just silly. And also, he gets off scot-free somehow. And that part kind of, it seems like it is it takes me out of the story. Like it doesn't seem real at all to me.
I think you're right. I mean, I think you know, one of the things I wanted to say to you about when you were sharing with the viewers the narrative part about how the temple is converted into a, you know, highly banal and domestic usage in the form of apartments, right? I think that the next section, where we actually have Rourke blowing something up, is just trying to hammer home the point that that if greatness is not recognized as greatness, it is effectively destroyed. Okay, and I think that the idea that it's destroyed through the banal use of sort of domestic daily life is much more powerful in that section than the subsequent one where he actually blows stuff up and goes all full on terrorist.
Yeah, definitely. It's yeah, and now that you point that out, it is kind of unnecessary too, because it makes the same point that the earlier section of the book makes, and does the earlier part does a better job of it.
No, I think that's right. And just talking to you now, I'm reflecting on how, you know, the blowing up of the building as a kind of a unnecessary rococo kind of flourish may also relate to what she's trying to point out about Dominique herself, right? Because this whole long tension of, do I destroy it? Do I save it? Do I blow it up? Do I keep it? Do I denigrate it? Do I worship it? You know, okay, so we've been there. And that final act of destruction is not particularly satisfying. Because I think back to that point about Tui, you know, and Rourke saying, I don't even think about you. It seems as if blowing up the building is kind of contradictory. No?
Yeah,
If he really had that kind of heroic capacity, there would be no need to blow it up.
right.
I
And
throw out there as a suggestion.
and also, just to make a libertarian point, like, if you design something, but somebody else fronts the money and construction materials, that they then that makes that person is the owner, the one who owns the materials that is made out of.
Well,
So,
I would argue. I mean, you could argue that it's a mixed up thing. It's no longer a one person or another person. No, I mean, and
oh
that's where
well,
like
I,
libertarian
I'm
forced into
I'm being a dogmatist
That's all
here.
right.
So
I can be a catmatist. Um,
okay.
sorry. It's late in the afternoon. But yeah, no, I think that's an interesting kind of comment on the type of extreme libertarian or extreme is not really the right word. You know, any group of people who encounter a kind of semi-system of thought and they're taken by the semi-system of thought, and decide then that they don't have to fill in the blanks. They're just going to take the semi-system and stay rigid with it, are fundamentalists. And I'm a bit allergic to them of any type, right? Whether they're fundamentalists, sort of libertarians who go, well, look, here is a set of frameworks, and we're just going with a rigid application of the frameworks, right? Rather than trying to work out the nuances. It's the same thing with a religion. It's the same thing with any position that finds itself able to be backed into a corner, where it just keeps making reference to the framework as a source of authority.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we can start working out the details once we can all agree that the government is a scam.
Oh, 100%. But I would also suggest that the government is always us. And so one of the things that we have to detoxify ourselves from is the idea that we have been scamming ourselves. That there
Now you're just blaming the victim, you victim blamer.
I'm simply saying that the idea of victim and perpetrator in many cases is not as simplistic as that, right? I mean,
No, I agree, yes.
I mean, one of the things I find myself saying a lot, right, is that we all created the legal framework that mandates corporations to pursue profits. We created that as a society. No, it is a set of legal frameworks that we impose upon ourselves. We did not mine corporations out of the earth. You know, they're not a physics law. So that is both a kind of burden of responsibility, but to me, that's also a really bright, shining hope light type of thing, because it means that we can change the rules. And that may not be a very civilized exercise. When human societies change their rules, it's always usually quite bloody and upheavally. But it does mean that we can have changed some of the things that have allowed us to become victims of our own selves. Just to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wish. Well, I think the rules would be a lot easier to change if people wanted to think abstractly about rules a little more, just in general. But the the people at the center with the biggest voices, they don't like that.
Oh, I think that's true, but I mean, this may sound overly condescending, right? And I know that we want to talk about this more in the future, but the people at the center, the people at the center, that I think one of the things that's true is that they're just not really thinking as much as most people think they're thinking.
Oh,
You know,
no, they're not.
and there's much less active doing than I think a lot of people think there is. And it would be a whole lot better if there were, because then we could get them to stop doing. So, our next chat may well be the banality of evil. I do think that there's a great deal of our situation that is a product of mediocrity, okay? As much as it is an unwillingness to think for ourselves. And if I can say anything about the Bitcoin phenomenon, I think one of the most radical parts is that we are seeing a wave of self-education, of autodidactism, that I don't really think we've seen for a couple hundred years. And that the last time, certainly in the West, that we had a kind of industrial shift linked to a really large mass self-education program, we had major social change. So whether it's in the domain of learning what software is, or it's thinking about how money functions, or it's even thinking about, well, what again is banking and why does it matter to me? We're really seeing big shifts.
Yeah, well, Bitcoin is interdisciplinary in a way that people haven't had to be before. So
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. The interdisciplinariness of Bitcoin is a really good point.
Well, thanks. And I don't have anything else on the Fountainhead. Do you have anything to add to the Fountainhead?
Well, I do. I do want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. Because of you, I actually managed to watch the movie, which I have known about for a long time and never did. And I definitely suggest that anybody who's ever read the book but not seen the film should immediately go and see the film, because I think there are only a few cases that I can think of where the film is better than the book. And I'm not saying you shouldn't read the book. I'm just saying it really does a good job of prepping a person who might be coming to the book for the first time, or maybe doesn't want to reread it. So that is one thing that I do want to say about it, and our experience with Fountainhead, and just how cool it's been to be able to talk about it.
Oh, well, I still wanted to talk about Ayn Rand, the cult leader. So I'll generalize a little bit, but to me, well, I talked about this a little bit last time, but to me, the thing about Ayn Rand is she said reason is good, so I like that, but she was not all that good at it, and so when she tried to be the philosopher, what she came up with was goofy.
Yeah,
and yet,
and I also think that one of her challenges, right, is that there she was suddenly talking to a whole group of men in ways that really didn't allow her to talk in the personal terms that fiction allowed her to write or speak about, right? So the fact that she was having affairs and had a husband and had a lover, and there was all kinds of complicated stuff going on in her own personal emotional life, and then she acquires a bunch of men who are all wanting her to speak like the Delphic Oracle. I think the woman was definitely challenged when it came to being able to talk about things in an abstract way that really should never have been talked about in an abstract way in the first place.
Sure, and well, to me, she is she's like a mad woman who speaks the truth sometimes, but it's treacherous. So
Exactly.
you have to figure out what is really going on. And to me, that's also part of the problem with what we were talking about of her writing style, where she is showing us the architecture.
Mm-hmm.
You have to that's kind of a trap, because you see all this, and then you might be tricked into trying to produce something just like it, rather than looking at the work a little more abstractly. See, because if you see how she builds everything, then you can imitate it pretty easily.
Right. And you can reassure yourself the need for certainty part of you. You can reassure yourself that you have a fully worked out system that has taken into account every single variable and has an answer for everything. And I think that's one of the things that we see with the group of men in particular who cluster around Rand and then start to produce their own works and their own systems, that start to quote her text as if it were a sacred text, which we see in all religious movements, right? Including those that are generally considered to be secular. My perspective that Bitcoin is, of course, a form of religion, and that's no way denigrating it. It's actually pointing to its power. Is that anything that has the capacity to induce belief and then actions that are based on a kind of faith in those beliefs is what we've always called religious. The problem becomes when it's being kind of a two-way conversation and becomes something where the people who are participating simply want to receive the truth. There you go. It's all done. Here's the system. So I think Rand gets to be a kind of producer of systems.
Yeah, and that's sort of that's bad. That's something you don't want.
Exactly.
I mean, particularly with her, like in general, that is a dangerous thing. But her in particular, she should not be the creator of the system by which you live, every aspect of your life.
Yeah, or the way in which you then decide that you don't have to carry on throughout the rest of your life navigating and negotiating between the powers of individualism and the powers of collectivism, for example. I mean, her works do allow people to take a kind of two-dimensional perspective once they start trying to pull out some kind of checklist system, as opposed to approaching her work as a piece of art, which, at the end of the day, we are talking about a piece of art.
Well, I guess to conclude, one thing that I did in my talk, How to Be an Independent Thinker, which is to try to present paradoxes. Because I'm saying, like, I cannot tell you how to do it. So if you try to if you try to just absorb what I'm saying, all you get is contradictions. So you have to go out and figure out your own ability to be independent. And you cannot. I guess I would say, like, Ayn Rand became less annoying to me from the perspective of a reader when I began to think of it this way, when I began to see contradictions not as something that needs to be resolved, but more as that this is a sign that this is where the work becomes treacherous. And it's time to
and treacherous being an awesome invitation to think for yourself. I think, as we both agree, right, is that the nature of the treacherous work is to kind of destabilize your own comfort zone.
Right.
And I completely agree with you that once you start to read that text or any text, and I'll just throw it in here, like including Satoshi's white paper. Okay, if you come to a text that is taken to be sacred in some regard, or is taken to encode within it some kind of a truth that matters very much to you, and you start to interact with it in a way that asks it and yourself questions, you get a much more rich and authentic experience than if you go to it looking for certainty and effectively a pass on having to think for yourself. One thing I did just want to share with you is that after our conversations about how do we cultivate independent thinking and so on, I thought about how in the last couple of years, there's been a real shift for me when I find myself, if I have a thought, from the highly personal through to the highly abstract, and I feel myself forming an opinion on something. I go and I ask, what assumptions are there that are informing this opinion? So instead of trying to kind of destabilize the opinion itself, it's actually asking, being just simply cultivating an awareness that we are all operating with assumptions. We have to operate with assumptions. We couldn't function without them, but that our metacognitive capacity allows us from time to time to say, hey, what are the assumptions that I'm working with here? And can I at least check in with them? Even if it's to simply validate, you know, those assumptions. I realize I've gotten kind of all abstract, and I can bring it to a concrete example, but with any work of art or with any work of thought, it is, I think, key to reminding yourself that you may be working with assumptions. It's true when you're making a market analysis, right? You may be working with assumptions. If you're not simply aware of having, you may end up with very different conclusions than you thought you were going to arrive at.
Sure. And well, and it's, what I like to do, what you just said. And another thing I like is to just try to change the assumptions,
Right.
because I like
Right.
to have
Exactly.
a more abstract view where, this is everything is like a special case of something more abstract, because then you
Right.
can think about a lot more different things.
I mean, I find myself thinking about things that inform my fears in terms of assumptions, right? So if, for example, I find myself, let's say, frightened by the idea that I might have to live in a sort of one bedroom, one bathroom place with my two children. And I've never lived anywhere that didn't have enough bathrooms for all of us, right? So, so you think about, okay, what is it that's informing that fear? And you start to kind of, it's speaking for my own self, right? Starting to kind of dig into, okay, what are some of the assumptions that are actually informing those fears? And if I ask questions of the assumptions, I may actually liberate myself from some of those fears. And that's, I think, one of the things that is most powerful, whether we're talking in like really personal terms or sort of more abstract terms. People don't make good decisions and don't manifest themselves well when they are coming from places of fear. So a lot of what is wrong about our current financial structure is I can read it in a form of people having, institutions even having given into fear, right? We're way too afraid to find out what happens if we let everybody fail.
Oh my God. Okay. Well, this leads into a different topic that
Right, I
we
know.
wanted
I've gone all
to
spaghetti-o on you. I'm
discuss, but I have to get going, so we will have to proceed later. Oh, and we should go back to this when we do our episode on Stephen King too,
Absolutely.
because Stephen King makes you confront uh, fears that you didn't realize you were going to confront when you started reading the book.
Very good.
But anyway, thanks for joining us, and well, I don't know what we're gonna do for the next episode, but we'll come up with something. Um,
We have days before Christmas, and I look forward to talking with you more, Daniel. I find it really really nutritive and yeah, just very stimulating. So thank you for your time.
oh well, thank you. I enjoyed talking with you too.
Super. See you on the next one.
See ya.